the squadron we had transpacked from El Toro over about an 8-day period. The squadron was VMFA 334. It was a newly formed squadron, newly formed in the sense that there were a lot of new crew members. Previously it was an F-8 squadron. The transpac went from El Toro to Hawaii, Hawaii to Wake, Wake to Guam, Guam to the Philippines, and then into Da Nang. Oddly, the date was not an accident. We landed in Da Nang August 31st, because if you had one day in country, you got combat pay for the entire month.
Not a bad deal. And no. Just to clarify for the camera, being assigned to VMF indicates that you were a Marine.
That's correct. Yes.
Fantastic. Now, Mr. Daly, were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted or volunteered, however you want to call it. I was in my junior year at Providence College. The recruiter came by, not really knowing what I was going to do when I graduated with a history degree. I was enticed by the prospect of flight training, and I was promised flight training if I signed up, and so I did.
What year was this event?
This was 1965. The recruiters were probably on campus in April, and I went up to Boston to be sworn in May 5th.
And so, 1965, you were aware that there was a war going on. Did that concern you?
No, it actually concerned some of my friends. I mean, you know, here you are, you're 20, and the prospect of flight training is enticing, and flight training in the Marine Corps is even more enticing. And you know, I had friends who said, don't you know there's a war going on? And, you know, Prussian fellow that I was at the time said, you know, it's only this little skirmish that's going on. Oh my God, you know, we can we can't defeat this whatever, you know. And you know, I think about that time, and I really wasn't paying too much attention to it. I think it was about that time, either before or after the Marines landed at Red Beach. It's within that time frame, but I wasn't really paying much attention. But then I went on to say, well, listen, I got another year of college. I got 18 months of flight training, 2.5 years. This will be over. You know, I mean, how wrong could I have been? I couldn't have been more wrong. But
now, where were you living at the time that you volunteered?
I was living in the dorm at Providence College.
And why did you choose the Marine Corps over any other branch of service?
You know, that's interesting. I have a theory that I've not been able to find proof for. But my theory is that the Marine Corps understandably targeted the Catholic colleges to recruit. And the reason I think that is that there was a lot of similarity in the spirit of the organization, in some ways the sense of elitism. The world may mock what we believe, but do not let them. And there's always been an aura of mystique about the Marine Corps in American culture, and it was something I fell for hook, line, and sinker. Whether I met the standard that might have been applied in other circumstances, peacetime, I wonder about it, but I wasn't going to ask any questions. And the reason I also think that is that I was I was raised an Irish Catholic. There's an old line from George Carlin, who also was raised an Irish Catholic in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He says, I used to be an Irish Catholic, then I became an American. You grow. Well, the reason that quote kind of stuck with me is my parents were Irish immigrants, and my dad used to talk about some discrimination Irish reached or experienced in the old Irish need not apply thing, but to the extent that existed, and I think it existed maybe in the 30s and 40s, that was long past by the time the 60s came about. But it was still part of the culture within the Irish Catholic community, of which, where I went to school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, St. John's Parish, and then North Cambridge Catholic. It was still part of it. The reason I recall it was part of it is I remember above the blackboards, so I guess they were green boards at the time, there were these patriotic quotes from someone who had from the greater Boston area, who had died in World War II, Commander Shea. And so looking back on this and putting it all together, the conclusion that I reached, that how the Irish American often dealt with the real or perceived discrimination was to out-American the Americans. And what better way to out-American the Americans was to join the armed forces.
Now, what were your first days of service like in the Marine Corps?
Well, I mean, what I did was what I joined was a so-called PLC program, the platoon leaders class, and if you joined in your freshman or sophomore year of college, you went for 2 6-week training sessions down in Quantico. My having joined as a junior, it was 1 10-week, and it was a basic training. It was if you were physically fit and you were enough of a stature, you didn't have a problem. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to ask, being in the platoon leaders course, although you were destined for aviation, were you still given the same training as any other?
Yeah. Oh, actually, you went through. Everybody went through. I mean, the presumption is a Marine officer will first and foremost be considered. I will put it this way: they didn't distinguish between the two. I mean, at that point, I was committed. They had committed to me to give me the flight training, but they didn't distinguish between that.
So you still did the rifle training?
Exactly. Although this was not my strong suits. There are 3 levels of badges. You ever see any Marine badges? Well, there's the pistol one. I forget whether there's a cross, and then there's another one. There's the lower level, and the bottom level is just a target. And that's what I got. And they were disparagingly referred to as toilet seats, and I had the 2 toilet seats. But most, I wasn't. Weapons marksmanship was not my long suit.
Would that be for a rifle and a pistol platoon?
Yeah, one's a rifle, one's a pistol. If the sharpshooter, expert sharpshooter marksman, and the expert had the crossed pistols or crossed rifles. I forget what the designation in the middle was, what it looked like. But anyway, every Marine will wear one below the whatever ribbons that they have. And
so, what was this boot camp training experience like?
It actually, I look back on it, I ran a lot. So as long as you were in fairly good physical condition, you could survive it, because it was basically, it wasn't like Actually, we spent the full 10 weeks in Quantico, I forget what they call it, Bayside. If you went to the 2 6-week programs, from what I'm told, the first 6 weeks was at a place much further out within Quantico, so-called Camp Upshur. And the stories I heard was much harsher. Probably came a little bit closer to Paris Island.
So was it random to which training facilities you assigned?
No, it was. If you went 2 6-week programs, the first 6 weeks was at Camp Upshur, the second week was Mainside. If you went a 10-week, as I did, all 10 weeks was Mainside.
But was there any chance that you'd be sent to Paris Island?
No. Well, here, maybe in a way, the club that they had hanging over you, and the ultimate prod to be sure that you didn't think about, have second thoughts about it, was DOR, drop on request, which was a euphemism for quitting. And the drill sergeants were saying, "Do you want a DOR?" "No, sir." Now, if you ever saw, there's a film, Officer and Gentleman, which is kind of a, Richard Gere plays the candidate, and there's a great actor who played the drill sergeant. Lou Gossett Jr.
Oh.
And it was filmed up in Washington State, but I think it was pretty much based on a comparable program that was in Pensacola, where if you're Navy, you're either a NAVCAD or MARCAD if you're Marine. And these are for folks who are going into the flight program that didn't have a commission. Didn't go through like the PLC program. It was an alternate route. And a couple of my friends, in fact, Larry Richards, who I mentioned earlier, the pilot who, squadron pilot who shot down a MiG when he was with an Air Force squadron. I guess he was a special assignment or something. He was a MARCAD, and one other fellow in our squadron, Rick O'Connor, he was MARCAD. And this approximated it, and I think that probably comes closest to what it was like going through Quantico. Only once we completed, then we went back, finished our senior year of college, and then upon graduation we got our commission. The NAVCAD MARCADs, however, didn't necessarily have a college degree. And then they went to Pensacola and went through a basic training program, and then went through the flight program as a MARCAD, NAVCAD, where there were lieutenants and ensigns for the Navy. I can't recall whether it took them until they got their wings before they got their commission. I kind of think it was, but I don't remember for certain. But anyway, as it was kind of when I think about it now, made manifest in that film. Lou Gossett was forever riding his name was Mayo, however, they kept on calling him Mayonnaise, accusing him of being soft, and "Do you want a DOR?" and "No, sir," etc. Well, the club was, if you dropped on request, quit, then you owed the Marine Corps 2 years as an enlisted person. So it was a pretty hefty club. But most people who went into the program, they were focused on the goal of the flight training, so not that many dropped out.
Do you remember your instructors?
Yes. Oh, God, yes. And actually, they were they're probably deceased today. They were pussycats, relative terms. There was a Sergeant E5, and it was a staff. Yes. Well, we remember the nicknames. Scar and Gar.
They probably didn't give themselves a chance.
No, they didn't. No, you never give. No, always someone gives his name. Well, they were good, but again, I was fairly fit. I was 6'1", 180 pounds, and so I kind of fell in the safe middle. There were some folks who were just absolutely remarkably fit, and you would climb. You had to climb. Part of the training was to climb a rope. And this one fellow, and he was from somewhere in the South, maybe South Carolina, Bobby Jones. He would just do arm over arm without his legs touching. Now, one of the amazing things about this training, and I don't know if we're digressing, but the thing that amazed me is there was two kinds of ropes you could climb: the knotted ropes, and then those without knots. And the surprising thing, that those without knots were easier to climb, because with the knotted ropes, you always had to raise your legs precisely to the knot. With the other, as long as you developed the technique as how to lock your feet, you could do it. Without, you could raise it this much, you could raise it this much, because you had the rope between your legs and between your feet. And then as you held on with your arms, you raised your feet as much as you want, you locked them, and you could go. That was always something I hadn't thought about that in a long time. It amazed me that the unknotted ropes were easier.
It's counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is counterintuitive, exactly. You're absolutely right.
So, how did you get through this training, mentally and physically?
Like getting through the entire experience, mutual support. Probably the most influential person, one of the most influential people in my life, and the most influential person at that point of my life and probably all of my career, was a fellow by the name of Lenny Bird. Lenny Bird came from Delaware, and he's the first one that challenged a lot of the things that I believed as I was growing up in the Irish Catholic heritage. He and I were totally different. His heritage was that he came from Delaware, and his family was in the Dutch Reformed Church. He was a superb athlete. He was a swimmer. He had the broad shoulders of a swimmer, and he had the most easygoing attitude, blonde-haired guy, and he, at the time, was engaged to a woman who was Catholic. Her name, Patrice Cozy. And he had the personal conviction and fortitude to look past the prejudices that he experienced growing up. And to the chagrin of his family, he pressed on and married Patrice. And sadly, his family wouldn't show up at the wedding at all. They just turned their back on him. But he had the courage of his convictions, and he used to poke fun in a very friendly way, about I should start to look beyond the narrow boundaries of what I experienced, and yes, that was the beginning of that. One of the best weddings I ever went to was his wedding. It was just absolutely spectacular. And he also introduced me to Happy Hour and Gin and Tonics. And again, I'm coming from my experience as a kid growing up in a very narrow-minded environment. This was the whole experience. So it always amazed me, and it never ceases to amaze me why we became friends. We became friends. The sad part about it is, unlike myself, he passionately wanted to be a part of it. He couldn't pass the physical. His eyesight did not measure up. In contrast, I had 20/10 vision. I had the eyesight, but not the passion. He had the passion, but not the eyesight. And the story has somewhat of an unhappy ending. Because of that, I went to the pilot training. He went to the NFO training. He was sent to Vietnam as a replacement in an F-4B squadron, and his plane
Mr. Daly, can you describe your pilot training?
Well, no, let me just finish off this. Sadly, his plane went down over Khe Sanh. It was, I thought it was during the battle for Khe Sanh during Tet, but I think later, because his name's on the wall in Washington, and I think it was probably closer to June. But the great tragedy is what a remarkable human being he was, and he had to die too soon.
Were you in country when you heard the news?
I don't know when I heard the news. I know I wasn't in country because that was the latest. It was June of '68, and I didn't get there till August 31st of '68, so it was before. When I found out, I don't recall.
And what were some of the other requirements for Marine Corps pilot training? How did the Marines determine whether you would go into rotary wing or fixed wing flight?
Well, the creme de la creme, everybody wanted jets. So it all depended on how well you did. I suspect there could have been some who preferred helicopters, maybe for some post-service ideas that they had. But for the most part, I imagine most of the pilots wanted jets because glamorous, exciting, etc. And nowhere near as dangerous as flying a helicopter. The casualty rate in helicopters were much higher.
Both training and combat?
I don't know combat for sure. I don't know about training. Everybody sought to excel. Now, like I said, I was in the pilot training program. It was the venerable T-34.
T-34 is the trainer version of what aircraft?
I think it was actually designed as a trainer, and I didn't intend this. I think it was a two-seater, and it anyway, whatever it was. So you, I think sat in the front, the pilot sat in the back, and actually, this is what it looks like, because I've seen this. I want to try this sometime. You can scan that. And so the program was initially, if I recall correctly, you had 13 so-called hops, and you were to solo on your 13th hop, if it was an unsuccessful one, then you'd get a down, and then you'd come back and repeat it and go on. And I got one down, but I got to the 13th, and I soloed. Quite an experience. And then you went on. There was a precision stage of 6 flights, where you and when I was thinking about the other day, I think the reason they did it was sort of like a confidence builder to move to the next level. They taught acrobatics and some simple stuff. I don't think we soloed. I think there was already somebody with us in this. The most fun thing, and I always remembered, I always often talk to my 2 girls about it, that you can sort of simulate doing a loop on a roller coaster, at least mentally. And all I can remember, this is what you would do is you'd have to get to a certain height, like around 5,000 feet, and you'd then pull back the power, aim the plane down, and as it went down, it would gather speed, get to a certain amount of speed, you pull back on the stick, and then what you're supposed to do is watch the wings go through the horizon. And you had to keep them level. And once you went through the horizon, you threw your head back and you waited for the horizon to come back to make sure the wings were level, and you did it. And but I mean, some of the other things, these wing overs and some other things, that I can't recall whether we even tried to do or taught a barrel roll or not. I don't know if the plane was powerful enough or not, but I don't remember. All I remember is doing the loops. They were such a thrill. And now as I'm thinking about it, and maybe I could check at some point that the logbook would tell me whether I actually went by myself or not. Well, it's not important, but maybe at one point it was something you would say where at least one of them I went by myself. Anyway, so I finished the primary and then went into the basic with the T-28, and the T-28 was much more of a powerful plane, and it was serious. T-28 was, I don't know if it was comparable to an A-1, but it had the engine was as powerful as in a helicopter.
And rotary wing pilots, did they also do primary on the T-28?
No, I did primary in the T-34 and then basic in the T-28.
So did rotary wings go through the same basic training as fixed wing pilots in the Marine Corps?
Everybody went through the same thing up to this point. I think once you got through the T-28 program, that's when they did the culling. You either then went on to helicopters or went on to jets. And if you went on to jets, then you went to Beeville, Texas, and there was a T2 there, a jet. And I don't know where the helicopter pilots went. Probably went to somewhere base in North Carolina. But I don't know. But anyway, this is where I ran into my problems, and I became, I got it down on one flight. I tried to land the plane with the gear up, and the instructor's in the back of the plane. He says, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I don't know." Now, this is where, if it was Lenny Bird, he would have pressed on through this, because you know what the ritual is. Even if you get that down, if you beg and plead, they'll let you back in. Now, I wasn't prepared to beg and plead, and I had another friend who went through the training command about the same time as I did, and he was on a night flight, and he crashed and died. McCabe. I can't remember McCabe's first name. I could see his face. I could even see the car that he had. It was an MG. But it kind of shook me, and I said, "My God, if someone as good a pilot as him and is at this risk, what am I doing here?" So I chose not to press on, and I think the Marine Corps had a big enough investment in me that they offered the training for Rio, and I readily accepted it and went on to Glencoe, Georgia, for the training there.
For the interview, could you please define what the acronym Rio stands for?
Radar Intercept Officer. The plane, the F-4, the plane that we, well, I guess actually was the actual designation is NFO, Naval Flight Officer, which is a generic term applicable to non-pilot crew members, and for the F-4, Radar Intercept Officer. For those of us who went on to the A6, the designation was a BN, a Bombardier Navigator. You sat side by side. Anyway, but we went through this basic NFO training together. The school was at Glencoe, Georgia. Our training was in kind of simulator insofar as the scope and what have you, and also in these DC-3s, and they had radar scopes that would take you up, and you do these intercept drills. And again, the irony was they used to have these intercept drills that they would tell you, I mean, essentially what it was they had another plane coming toward you, and you were supposed to give the pilot steering instructions so as to put you in a position to have optimum firing position. And they would have these drills where they would tell you it's a certain angle, they were harder than ones where I know what to tell you. They would tell you the heading of the other plane, so that then you were supposed to do calculations, whatever.
Computer assisted, or
No. This was good old dead reckoning. But the irony was the unknowns were the easiest, because you would get the radar image on the scope, and all you had to do is keep it centered. Because when you think about it, I used to love these terms, intercept geometry. If you think about it, I thought about it many times. If you let's assume you go along the highway and a car is coming on an auto ramp. If somebody stays, not centered, but it has to stay at the same point, keep it not moving. If that car stays at exactly the same angle off where you're headed, then inevitably you're going to collide, right? So you'd intercept. So that's the way you could do it. And then there was also exercises, and I can't remember how. That was for the Sparrow, the head-on. And then there was another radar guided, yes. And then there was other exercises where you were to then come around behind the other plane.
For
infrared, yes. The Sidewinder, thank you. Yeah, no. I need help on names. So that was basically the training.
So what would be the difference between locking on with radar or with in terms of planning an intercept or radar contact?
Now I'm trying to remember. I think maybe I'm mixing together the training that we got, the intercept training, which then got you, and then at Glencoe, then you got your wings. Actually, I think I have a picture. I was going to the pictures. My younger sister came down. There's a picture of her painting the wings on. And then you went on to the training, and I can't recall where it was, but the training with in the F4 itself. Now, what we had in back was a scope that was sort of recessed, and then you pulled it out between your legs. And you had like a little joystick that you could maneuver. What were we maneuvering? I can't recall exactly. But anyway, the pilot on the left had a smaller version of what you see. So what you did and what resulted, he could see. And the whole idea was you would give steering instructions until you were in this optimum area for the Sparrow, and what would happen is when you got a circle and the visual representation on the scope. God, I haven't remember this in a long time. And it's interesting, the stuff that stays in your mind. And as you got from the maximum range to the best range, the circle would shrink around this dot. And you got to a point, and then if you got too close, then the circle would get bigger again. So the pilot would be flying, and I guess in an operational situation, would be looking for this other plane coming towards him. But when you got to the optimum point, the jargon was you'd say to the pilot, "You've got the dot." So now the pilot will fly the plane using the scope, and that became an expression when you wanted to say to someone like in the Navy, they might say, "You've got the con, you've got control." You'd be saying to the pilot, "You've got the dot," or you'd say to somebody else, "Okay, you're in charge. Okay, you've got the dot."
Would there be any kind of tone in the headset, any kind of radar tone or lock on?
There could have been, I don't remember, you know.
What kind of azimuth, what kind of sweep did you have on the radar on the nose? Like, would it be 180 degrees?
No, I don't think it was that much. 45, maybe 60, I don't know. As I think I mentioned to you earlier, I had the NATOPS manual for the F4, and all that is in there. And which is there's another thing in there that always amazed me, another bit of jargon that has made it into popular culture that disturbs me to no end, that it's not understood and is misused. It's the concept of the edge of the envelope. What is it? Pushing the envelope. The expression, the shorthand is pushing the envelope. The real expression is pushing the edge of the envelope. And I think, you know, there's less than 1% understand where it came from. And again, it's in, if you go back to the NATOPS manual, and it's for graphic representations of the capabilities of the aircraft under certain circumstances. So, for example, if you were graphing the rate of turn of the plane versus the speed, the ideal, and then you'd have a graphic representation of it on an XY axis. At some point, if you turn too hard, you're going to flip out of control. But if you don't turn hard enough, you don't get the maximum capabilities. So what the envelope was on the graph a visual drawing of the outer limits. And what those outer limits were the known outer limits. Ideally, if you're operating at peak performance, you would be operating right on the edge of that envelope.
Did your aircraft ever exceed the envelope?
No, not that. But what a test pilot is to do is to push the edge of the envelope. This is the known maximum capabilities. Is it the maximum capabilities? That's for the test pilot to decide. But the edge of the envelope is such that once you reach the absolute, as opposed to the known, once you reach the absolute, then you would spin out of control. So pushing the edge of the envelope is pushing known maximum capabilities beyond that to the absolute.
I've always been fascinated with etymology. Thank you for...
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Yeah. And when they keep on saying pushing the envelope, well, that means like you're pushing it down the road. Well, in the back of the NATOPS manual are all these graphs of various forms of performance data, and the graphs are the envelopes. And I'll try to find it. I know I have it. It's in the house someplace.
I would appreciate it. I didn't have your question.
Okay.
Now, did this conclude Leo training?
Well, I think at some point the NFO training probably didn't have this stuff with the scopes. Then I think then I was assigned to the VMFA 334 down to El Toro, and like I say, when I get out there, the squadron had only recently formed up. It was previously an F8 squadron. There were some folks there ahead of me. But for the most...
At this point, is the Phantom a new aircraft?
Phantom itself was not a new aircraft. The model that we had was new, the F4J. The Navy, I think the Phantom, if I understand correctly, was developed for the Navy for launch, for both air-to-air and as a weapons platform, that is bombs, etc. And the prototype was the F4A, if I am correct. F4B was the operation model for years, and then the upgraded version for the Navy Marine Corps was the F4J. And I think 334 had was one of the first, at least the first that I knew of, that had the F4J, and there was a sister squadron there also, VMF 232, and they were the Red Devils. 334 with the Falcons. And also you had a tail designation when you were talking to people on the outside. You would use the tail designation. It was W or Whiskey Uniform. I can't remember the tail designation for 232, but they all had that. Now, when you were talking internally, the call name, whatever you want to call it, I don't know what they called it, the flight leader was it. So some of the more colorful, there was a red-headed fellow, his Carrot, so you'd be Carrot 1, his plane would be Carrot 1, we'd be Carrot 2, or whoever it was, you know, there was a whole bunch of them. There was one fellow, Bill Rath, he was Black Hawk. There was Black Hawk 1, and he was Black Hawk. There was
So these call signs would be determined by the pilot?
Well, the pilot had, he had kind of a nickname, and again, you go back to film, Top Gun. Top Gun, yeah. Now, what was different, maybe they changed it when the F-14 came in, nobody in the backseat had a name. You all went by, it's just the pilot.
Goose in the film.
That's Goose. He was in the backseat. Yeah, there was no such thing. Because everything else about it felt authentic to me. Maybe this was the development that came. The F-14 succeeded the F-4. The example, the part played by Tom Cruise, Maverick. So if he was leading a flight, his plane would be Maverick 1 and anyone would be Maverick 2. And if they were, under some circumstances, like in a cross-country or that Transpac that I described earlier, they had up to 5 planes, then it would be Maverick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that was used for internal communications between and amongst the planes, not with the controllers of the outside world.
And with the squadron designated as the Falcons, would you have any OZAR or anything that would reflect that?
There is on the side of the plane a Falcon, and every squadron, and there was, actually heard someone refer to it the other day, they always had the mugs, and you always had a mug, and one side would have, well, the Falcon. It's on here someplace.
What was it? I can't remember what squadron it was. The Jolly Rogers?
Yeah, that's the Jolly Rogers, I don't know. I know there was one Grey Ghost, but this is the Falcons, and that's what the Falcons would look like. And that was on the side of the plane, and this decal was on the side of a coffee mug, and then your name was on the other side. And when you were in the ready room, everybody had the mugs.
So the one to the right of the Crusaders?
This was when I was in Japan, and that was an F-4B squadron. And then finally, I don't think I have the one for 451. I don't know why I don't have it. And again, just to go on, the Phantom Ferret was the guy in the back, me, and the pilot was the Phantom Flyer, P-H-Y-L-E-R. If you want to just run through the others. I got a bunch of patches here that really are post-dated. My stepson, who's a chief petty officer, these are some ships that he was associated, the most prominent of which was the JFK. So I just added it. Yeah, it is. Just wrapping the whole thing up. If you had at least 100 missions in Vietnam, you got that patch. You had about 160 plus, which didn't compare to some of the guys who had over 200. And then this was, later, this is the Jolly Green Giant, the Air Force helicopter that picked me up when I ejected the second time.
So that Stallion, CH-52?
I don't know. The squadron itself is on here. It's the 37 ARRS. And so it's I think it's probably Air Recovery and Rescue Squadron is what I would guess, but I don't know.
That's quite the tab. I've never seen that one before.
What's that?
The Rescued by tab?
Yeah. Well, you know what? I guess they're proud of what they do, and they want to advertise to the world, you know, their success. So, you know, I was happy to wear it.
Sure, you're pretty happy when they showed up.
Yeah, for lots of reasons that maybe we'll get into
We'll
later.
get to that story. Okay, now from El Toro, where did your squadron go?
Well, like I say, the squadron transpacked to Da Nang. Actually, the first time, I don't know when we left. I could probably tell you the first time we went. My plane I was with. Well, what we did was we were able to mutually select the pilot that you wanted to fly with. The pilot and myself and a fellow by the name of John King agreed to fly together.
You're probably both the same rank.
We were both first lieutenants at the time, and the option was to fly with the most senior experienced pilot, but most of them were former FA pilots, and they were less inclined, understandably, to share in the responsibilities. If you got a pilot who was fresh out of the training command as you were, then you had a more cooperative working effort, and that's what we chose.
And this derived from the FA being a single seat pilot.
That's right. So let's see. In August, we were originally supposed to go on the 16th, but John King, what was this, the 20th? Maybe it was the 20th, I don't know. We came back because there seemed to be some malfunction with the canopy, and since we were going that distance over the water, wisdom dictated to come back and have it checked out. So went off the second day, and it was just as it was uneventful until we got near to Hawaii, and we went in 5 planes together, and the head, God, I should know what they call it. They called 4 planes division 5, 2 together, something else. 5, I think, was unusual. Maybe it was just 5-plane formation. And the senior pilot was a fellow named Major Johnson, and dutifully, you know, they would check fuel levels in the planes, you know, just to see how you're doing. What happens is when the plane initially takes off, the wings are not fuel cells containing fuels. The fuel gauge only will record the amount of fuel in the main fuel cells of the main part of the body. So what happens, what the pilot does as the flight ensues, is as they burn up fuel from the main part of the main fuel cells, then they would transfer fuel from the wings. Well, at some point, as we're getting closer and closer to Hawaii, the fuel readings that John was given to Major Johnson was consistently lower than the others, and they came to conclude that the valves transferring the fuel from the wings was malfunctioning. So he sent the other 3 planes on, and we were probably still maybe 50 to 100 miles away, and given what the fuel that was left in the main part of the main fuel cells, it didn't appear that we were going to make it. So that's why Major Johnson sent the other 3 on, and then it was us tucked in with his wing. Always a fascinating thing, flying formation. And again, we used to sometimes simulate it in cars. You trusted implicitly the lead plane. All you did was, and this is the pilot, and I'm doing this with my hands, this is the way they talked. You would get tucked in, and the important thing was to control the relative motion of the two planes. The lead plane was flying, and you were just almost like attached, like invisible line. He turned, you turned. He climbed, you climbed. Remarkable feat, going 450 knots. And as a precaution, which turned out to be necessary, they launched a C-130 tanker from the base in it'll come to me in the Marine base in Hawaii, met us, and then we had to refuel. And, obviously, we weren't the most experienced in the world. It was an experience. What happens is on the F4, the fuel probe comes out from the left, and for the pilot, it's kind of like, if I recall correctly, about right it is eyesight. For me, I could sort of look at it, but the KC-130 would let out this long hose with the big basket. The basket was probably 2 feet across, 3 feet across. But it wasn't that easy to get the probe into the basket because of the slipstream coming past. As you would get towards the basket, the slipstream would push the basket out. And, there was, as was commonly referred to at the time, the old pucker factor. And as you're getting closer and closer, and Major Johnson was getting impatient, and he said, "God damn it, just put it in there!" And bam, John put it in, and we landed. Everything was fine, got enough fuel, we landed. When we landed, it was a remarkable experience. You landed, and they had family members of people on the base. Now, I can't think of the base, it's on the north side of the island. It will come to me. I keep on saying Iwakuni, but that was the base in Japan. It will come to me. And they had family members who were already there. You get off the plane, and they had put a lei on you and a pineapple with something to drink out of it. And I got some great pictures of John King and myself somewhere, which we will produce them.
So what was the resolution? What was the malfunction?
The malfunction apparently was the valve malfunction on the transfer from the fuel, the valve that controlled the fuel from one of the wings. So, obviously it was fixed, and we went on. Stayed in Hawaii for a day or so, and then on to Wake. And Wake it was in terms of problems with the airplane that was done from there on in. But going to Wake, and I was notorious for having a camera in the cockpit with me, which got me into a world of grief later on. But when we came to Wake, again, it's 5 planes. And if I recall correctly, we were the 5th plane. So here is this little horseshoe in the middle of the Pacific, coral reef, really, horseshoe in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we're all tucked in, ready to land. And being the last plane, here I am clicking. So I got 4 planes against the backdrop of the blue sky, the blue ocean, and little Wake down there. So that was good. So then Wake Island was in many ways the pits, because it was just, it played a major role in World War II, but what it was then was just this lagoon surrounded by these crushed shells that you couldn't walk on with your bare feet. And it essentially was, and it had become at the time, a way station for commercial airliners. It was run by Pan Am. I think that must have been terrible duty to be stuck out there, unless your plan was to work in your tent. But anyway, we moved on to Guam. That was uneventful. Moved on to the Air Force Base in the Philippines. I remember it just being rainy and the lights in the harbor. And then into Da Nang landing, August 31st. And it was kind of an eerie feeling, not really knowing what to expect. And we didn't fly for a couple of days. I guess they let us get acclimated. Anyway, so September and October were the last 2 months that there was any bombing of the North. Yes, it did. 2 of which I remember. And then, I don't know if it had been announced already, but President Johnson announced that they were going to cease bombing over the North effective November 1st. Parenthetically, the last plane to get shot down over the North was someone from 334. They both survived. George Livy was the pilot, and Bill Frisell was the Rio. Frisell was unique in many respects because, like me, he had a reserve commission. Like me, he was a non-pilot. Unlike me and unlike all of his other contemporaries, he opted to stay in, and he rose to the level and retired a full colonel. And jumping forward just a bit, we had a reunion, and after 25 years, whatever 68 plus 25 was, and he came there. He was still on active duty at the time, and his assignment at the time was a very unique one. He was second in command to an Army Major General based in Hawaii, to liaison with the governments of South Vietnam about recovering possible POWs, etc. And I was of the opinion, and he did disagree, that at that time there could never be any POWs. The whole value of POWs was for over leverage, but once the war was over, and certainly by the early 90s, there was no reason to keep POWs. So either they had died or they had all been killed, and this POW, MIA, black flag irritates me to no end because it's carrying on a hope for families that can't possibly have any basis, and I think it's only used for political reasons. And with that, I will shut up. Anyway, so
so your first 2 months in the country, 4 months, September.
All right, so yeah, September, October. So there was at least 2 times I flew north. Once, both times with John King was the pilot. I don't recall who, and we were the second plane. I don't recall who was the pilot in the O&E first plane. All I remember is our job was to drop napalm on top of a hill to clear for a landing zone. I don't even remember if that was in the north. It was in the north. It must have been in the north because there wouldn't be any landing zone clearing for in the north. And all I remember was seeing tracers being shot, and they were just coming high, but boy, it was hard to sort of concentrate when you're doing. It's the first time I ever experienced anything like that. So that's about all I can remember of that. The second time was the most significant one, which resulted in the crew members from the plane getting a so-called single mission air medal. And some were buried in the archives of the Marine Corps. A copy of the citation went with it. Sadly, all my copies of that got lost because a locker that I had I didn't pay attention to, and it got lost. But anyway, I'm sure I could duplicate it if I went looking for it. It was one of 2 that I think I could come away with a sense of satisfaction. There was the target, and you didn't find out about the target until you got airborne. You got airborne, and you were passed from controller to controller until finally you there's someone who's actually going to control the bombing itself. It could be somebody on the ground, which was the second incident I wanted to talk about. A unit commander, a platoon commander, or someone who needed some support. But it often was, I think it also went by the designation Forward Air Controller. They were in little Cessnas, flying around about 1,500 feet. And in fact, my friend Rick O'Connor, who I saw a couple of weeks ago in California, filled me in more about what was going on. I always thought that they were terribly at risk all the time, flying at 1,500 feet. And he says, yeah. He says, no, not really. If they thought you didn't see them, then they weren't interested. But if they thought they knew that the fact knew of their presence, then they were enormously at risk. I mean, they're not going. It's like you're not going. If you're the rabbit out there and you think the hunter can't see you, well, you're not going to stick your head up. But if you think the hunter can see you, now you're going to do something defensively. Rick, I hope I explained it correctly. Anyway, and he was an F-4 pilot, but I think he spent some time as a FAC, or at least training as a FAC.
So the details of the mission.
So we were dealing with one of these FACs. Now, the reason that it had great value is that at the time the Marines at Quezon were under enormous pressure from fire across the DMZ, and there was this one particular artillery piece that was doing some serious damage, as I recall. And our job was to try to take out this artillery piece. Now, when you flew in the north, or you flew in Laos, you were likely to encounter any aircraft fire.
Now, this be AAA and SAMs as well?
I think it was mostly AAA. I think the SAMs were I never saw a SAM. I never heard anything about a SAM. I think the SAMs were all up around Hanoi guarding facilities there. But this was AAA to guard this piece of artillery. And so there was a special, I guess we must have known we were going for it because we were briefed for this. She did something that they called a wagon wheel pattern. Normally, when you did close air support for Marines on the ground, or any other unit, of course, but since the Marines had the northern province of Quang Tri, if I'm correct, it was only Marines that we gave air support to. Your pattern had to be, you figured out you learned where the line of the troops were. And so you always flew parallel to the line and away from them, so that you wouldn't expose the Marines on the ground that you were supporting to bombs that fell short or fell long, and that if it was something like rockets, and the rocket fired late, that when you turned off, you were turning away from the troops on the ground. The downside to that was your flight pattern was predictable. So if there were enemy forces on the ground, once you established the pattern, it remained, and so they knew when you were coming, and they could The upside was, under those circumstances, the firepower was, could have been a rifle, could have been, but something nowhere like AAA. Now, you briefed for the probability of AAA when you flew into the north. I don't know if this was the only time I went into the north, but anyway, you had this, instead of the normal pattern, for better or for worse, you didn't have concern about folks on the ground. There were no Marines there. So you do this wagon wheel pattern, and to avoid the predictability of where you would come down, the way it was briefed was we had Zuni rockets. These are I think 5-inch rockets, and you had the bombs. They're probably 500-pound bombs, whatever the max of them. And we were briefed to make 2 runs. John King and I were, you do the wagon wheel was the image, and at the time that you felt appropriate, you'd peel off and you'd go down. You'd go down, right. You'd go down so that you could come from any angle, and so they didn't know where you were coming from. It also was very steep. It was probably a 60-degree dive. Normally in the south there was a 40-degree dive, but you wanted to be steep, and the goal was you could be more accurate. But
aiming with dead reckoning, or?
Yeah, it was pretty much. Well, what it was, I mean, there were design parameters. You could dive at 10 degrees, 30 degrees, 45, and 60. It was more often than not the 10 degrees and the 30 degrees of fun. And there were parameters that went something like this. I think, I'm really testing my memory, but to take a 45-degree dive, the pilot you'd get to 10,000 feet, and you'd have to be at 10,000 feet at a given airspeed. And then he would get into the 45-degree dive. Once he's got himself situated in the dive, then he would put his gun sight on the target. Our function in the back was to monitor airspeed and altitude. So that normally, if I recall correctly, and it could have been at a different angle, you would drop at 3,000 feet. Maybe that was the 30 degree, and the 45 degree was a little bit higher, 40, whatever it was, whatever the parameters were. And so you developed a sense, because what you wanted to do at the point of dropping the bomb, you wanted to be going 450 knots. And I guess it's just a matter of physics. 450 knots, so many feet above the ground. The gun sight on the target, you should hit it. There was always the possibility, for one reason or another, you had to correct. And so if you were going too fast, then you had to drop higher. If you were going slowly, or you got to that point, then you'd have to go further and drop, otherwise you'd end up dropping too short.
You in the back seat have got to be pretty quick with the trigonometry.
Well, it was almost, I don't know what we based it on. I think ultimately it was just because we spent so much time practicing in the bombing patterns over Eastern California and in desert Arizona, and there you dropped 2.5-pound bombs with shotgun charges, and they had this circular target, and there was again they were very big on statistics. You would get a CEP, circular error of probability, as to what your chances were you hit the target, and more than that, I'd have to rack my brain I'm sure. If you went on Wikipedia, CEP, or circular error of probability, would explain the whole thing. So I think you developed part of it, you developed certain instincts I mean, all going through the flight training program, you were given these academic programs about aerodynamics and power plants and stuff. And it's kind of like, oh yeah. But once you experience it, you knew it, you absorbed it, it came into your DNA. And that's the best thing I can sort of say. So we're doing this thing, we're coming down, and you had the ability to make the adjustments. And this is where it became the wisdom of choosing another first lieutenant as your other crew member. They came to rely on you, and the more they came to rely on you, the more you had the responsibility, and hopefully rose to that occasion. So you can make those adjustments. So that's what we had to do. That was the generic. So in this particular situation, if I recall correctly, a 60-degree dive, we'd come in at least at 10,000 feet. And whatever the drop point was, maybe 4,500 feet. So whatever the drop point was, you'd make those adjustments. And as you get close and close to that drop point, whether it had to be adjusted or not, you'd go stand by, mark. And on mark, the pilot would hit the pickle. And again, if they trusted you, they would hit that pickle when you told them to do it. Now, getting the silly chill. Now, it's because you're diving so steeply, now the G-forces are pulling out. The steeper the dive, the faster you're going, the bigger the G-forces. It was a rush. I mean, you're scared, especially in a situation like that. It was a rush. And as you pulled off, especially, it was like with napalm, as you pulled off, you had mirrors here, and you could see the explosion in the mirrors and this whole thing. I mean, I think about it later, and I think about, like the damage that we did, and I'm certain some non-combatants bore the brunt of what happened. At the time, you're 24, and it's just this exciting thing that you're doing. So
have you hit the artillery?
So we get to the actual flight. So the way it was briefed was John and I would go down with the Zunis, and the whole purpose of the Zunis was to suppress the air. And you're firing and unlike dropping a bomb, as you're going down, you're firing rocket after rocket after rocket. And the whole idea, and you could see where they're hitting, and he could adjust. I think the firing of the rockets is pretty much the pilot's bailiwick. And the whole idea was anti-aircraft suppression. Right behind would come the other plane. And so you've suppressed the anti-aircraft, and he's right behind you. He drops his bombs using the criteria he did before. We're back up. Now, it's this guy, this was the CEO of the squadron at the time, Jim Sherman. He took over once we landed in Da Nang. The previous CEO, Lieutenant Colonel Van Kampen, just assembled us, trained us, brought us, and then passed it on to Sherman. And the guy in the back seat, Lenny Catanzaro, this was his second tour in Vietnam. And in fact, Lenny was among the people who trained us when we were in Glencoe. And he was one of the two senior Rios. He and another guy, Tom Stone, were already captains. And these are the guys that used to get to fly with the CO and the XO on a regular basis. So now it's time, and Colonel Sherman is supposed to go down and fire the rockets, and then John and I follow. Well, we were flying with one of these guys in the little FAC flying around, and so when the rockets first went down, and he reports back, "You're a little bit long on the rockets." And then Colonel Sherman's bombs, he says, "You're a little bit short," and he's telling us, "Just bracket it, just right in the middle." Well, Colonel Sherman's going down, and his rockets didn't fire, and I'm going, Jesus. And John, he just pressed on, went down, bam. Well, we pull off, you know, and this, you always get, because they were so statistically minded, you know, you want to know KIAs, you want to know battle damage assessment, KIAs or whatever.
Secondary explosion.
Yeah, and things like that, and what happened. And so the board air controller comes on and he says, I'd like to tell you what exactly that you hit, but I can't because there's nothing but a crater was there. Well, I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, you know, this was one of the times that was satisfying, because we did something positive for these poor Marines who were getting clobbered. Anyway, so ultimately we ended up getting this single mission air medal for that. And that's it. Now the amazing thing about John King.
So, first of all, I think it might be time to conclude part one and 3 seconds for part two.
Okay, do you have 30 seconds?
30 seconds?
Okay, 30 seconds it is. John King was amazing in that you looked at him and he was a mild-mannered guy, and you would not think of him as being a fighter pilot. When you get into the plane and strapped it on, it was like a gunslinger, and he could fly that plane like, I mean, all the naval aviators were great, but it was just incongruous, his image versus who he was, and his goal was to be a test pilot at Patuxent. I don't know if you ever did, because when 3 months later I went with 3rd Battalion South Marines, and I don't know where he went. Sadly, I heard he went back to his farm, and what he wanted to do was a crop duster, and he had a farm in Oklahoma, and he died an untimely death. He fell off a tractor and injured his spleen and bled to death. That's the story I understand. So it's another one of these ironic stories. Anyway, my 30 seconds are up.
To go through so much of that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this will conclude part one of the interview.